Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with Wayne Armstrong, who's one of our senior consultants here at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider. So today Wayne and I are going to talk about how to plan and conduct a successful ISO 27001 audit. So my first question for you, Wayne, is we're going to start at the beginning here. What are the key things you need to remember when planning your audit program?
There's a lot to cover. So you've got all of the clauses and controls in the standard to cover all of the requirements of your policies and things like that. And so the first thing to consider is you don't need to do it all in one go. So when you're putting your audit program together, just consider spreading out the workload. We tend to talk about doing this over a 3-year period. The reason we do that is because for organizations that are certified against a standard, your certificate tends to last for 3 years. So it's probably worthwhile having those two things aligned. The standard talks about ensuring that you consider the importance of the processes concerned and the results of previous audits when you're planning your program. So it's probably a good idea to not just, sort of evenly spread out the number of controls and clauses over that 3-year period. You need to put some thought behind it in terms of which audits need to be done when, etc. So the way in which we tend to advise organizations to consider the importance of processes is through the risk management process. So in terms of the processes that represent significant impact and things like that on the organization, should they go wrong, they're the things that should be audited more often and probably sooner in the audit program. Whereas some of the other controls, probably in Annex A of the standard, probably don't need to be audited as often because they're not related to risky processes, etc. There are another couple of things that you can throw in there as well. I mean, the standard talks about considering the results of previous audits. So if you're getting audit findings, significant audit findings from previous audits, then maybe consider auditing those areas more often. And also through incident management. So if you're getting incidents in a particular area, then consider auditing those areas more often. And I guess the key to this is that when you put that 3-year plan together, it's not just it's not set in stone. So it's got to be sort of dynamic and responsive. So if you are starting to get incidents in a particular area, you can adjust your audit program accordingly, or if you identify new risks, you can adjust your audit program accordingly. So it kind of needs to be sort of monitored and managed over a period of time.
To sort of zoom in a little bit more now, what must you remember when it comes to planning for each specific audit?
There's several things come to mind. I guess the first one would be don't leave things till the last minute. So we're talking about planning and preparation for audits. Now, depending upon who you're auditing or who your auditees are, for example, it may be quite difficult to get in their diaries. They might be really busy people. So particularly I'm thinking of senior managers, etc. It can be quite difficult to get time in their diaries. So don't spring surprises on people. Don't leave it till the last minute. Contact them several months in advance to say, we've got this audit coming up. Can we have some time in the diary, please? There are other practical things to think about as well in terms of the planning the audits, because there's lots of different sizes and complexities of organizations out there. So you need to consider things like where will the audit take place? What travel arrangements need to be made, hotel arrangements, things like that. So all of the logistics that go with it. Also, you've got to consider the area that's going to be audited. So what sort of skill set do you need with regard to the person conducting the audit? They need to obviously be experienced with regard to ISO 27001, but also probably some level of experience or knowledge around the area to be audited. So if you're auditing technical controls, do you have a good enough technical understanding to audit those controls effectively? If not, maybe identify another auditor that might be able to do it. And there's lots of examples of different sort of experience that might be needed. If you're going into the legal department, you might need some legal sort of knowledge or experience, or if you're looking at physical security, you might need that knowledge and experience. So consider what you're auditing and ensure you choose auditors that are suitable for performing that particular audit. And again, sort of coming back to the sort of complexity and different sort of ways in which organizations operate and where their locations might be, consider whether you might need interpreters, you might need translators, you might need someone that is able to guide you around a particular physical location. So if you're on site doing physical security auditing, you need somebody to show you around that knows the place well. Do you need things like training, for example? So again, if you're going to turn up on site, for some locations, there might be health and safety kind of induction training that you might need to do. You might need to wear protective clothing and hard hats. It could be all sorts of different things. So consider all of those different aspects of the individual audits, where they're going to be, etc., to ensure that you've got everything in place before you conduct it.
So do you have any tips for auditors that might come in handy when they are conducting audits?
So there's a couple of things that I always do when I'm conducting audits. So obviously we are auditing against a set of criteria. Now, in most cases, that set of criteria is documented within the standard itself. So we're talking about ISO 27001. So we've got all of the mandatory clauses, we've got the 93 controls in Annex A, and with the best will in the world, I can't remember all of the detail of every single control and every single clause. So my first tip, and one of the things that I always ensure that I do, is have a copy of the standard with me, whether that's open in the background on your laptop or whether you've got a physical copy. I always carry a paper copy around with me as well. So that would be my first tip. And another one that goes hand in hand with that as well is also consider having a copy of the guidance. So in terms of ISO 27002, there's lots of really good guidance in there around how organizations might implement the requirements of certain controls in Annex A, for example. And so therefore it makes sense that you could use that as an aide memoire when you're auditing, in order to ask the right questions when it gets to how did you do this and those kinds of scenarios. And it's always a good place to consider where you might, as an auditor, suggest improvement opportunities as well. So you might spot things that the organization isn't doing, but is documented as best practice within 27002. If it's relevant, you may well use that as a suggestion for an improvement, etc. You could also, I tend not to do this one too much, but I know some auditors do this, and it's useful for ensuring that you don't forget to cover certain aspects during the audit. So consider putting a question set together ahead of time so that you cover all of the relevant areas and you don't miss anything. One thing I would say about that in terms of its use is sort of don't be bound by it. Use it more as an aide memoire to ensure you don't miss anything. But don't be sort of frightened to go outside of the scope of your question set if you're observing certain processes in action, etc. Ensure that also when you are performing the audit and you're observing all of the different processes and the things that people are doing, etc., make sure you take copious notes. So record everything that you've seen, everything that you've read, who you spoke to, versions of documents, names of different systems, etc., because it's that evidence that will provide management, when it comes to reporting, a sense that you have looked in all the right places, etc. And also, if they want to then follow up and go and look at the problem themselves, they know exactly where to look because you've reported what the actual evidence was that you recorded. And obviously, if you don't put it in your notes, chances are a lot of that won't make it into the final report. And then the final thing, I guess, is around time management. So we tend to obviously only have a certain amount of time with certain auditees. We've got a minimum set of things that we need to cover with that auditee. So make sure that you manage your time effectively and cover all of the things that are required to be covered. One of the things that can detract from that is if you observe particular behavior or something going on or something comes up as part of the responses from the auditee to your inquiries. That means you might go sort of, we kind of refer to it as chasing down rabbit holes. So you're following the evidence or following a particular process and you kind of drift off scope of the audit and things like that because the thing you're looking at is interesting. Try not to do that too much, and certainly try not to do it to the extent that it has a detrimental impact on your ability to manage time for the audit. Because if you run out of time and you don't get to cover everything, your chances of getting another session with that auditee may actually be quite slim. Because don't forget, we said earlier on, we've probably arranged these sessions months in advance. So yeah, there's probably lots of other things that we could come up with, but there are a few of my sort of go-tos when I'm conducting audits.
Perfect. Thank you, Wayne. So what things need to be considered when reporting on audit results?
If we're thinking about putting together a formal audit report, one of the first things obviously is to consider, well, who does this report go to? And in fact, during opening meetings, for example, right at the beginning of the audit, I'll always reconfirm who I'm going to send the audit report to, and also consider sort of the timeliness of that. Is there any urgency around ensuring that they receive the report, etc., and confirming when they're going to receive it? In terms of the content of the report, I mentioned one of these obviously a few minutes ago, and that's in terms of ensuring everything is accurate within the report. So hopefully you can go back to your notes and everything's written down in terms of what you saw and what you observed and what you were told. So all of that information should find its way into the final report. So we state what evidence we saw, such that anybody reading the report should be able to go and look at the same document or the same system and see the same evidence, so that they can sort of put a plan of action together to resolve the issue, etc. In terms of writing the report, ensure it's written in clear and easy to understand language. So stay away from jargon, try and stay away from acronyms and things like that. If you do have to use them or you do want to use them, then make sure you define what they are. And this is mainly because the audience may well not be technical. They may not understand a lot of the technical jargon that you might include in such an audit report. It's likely that the audit report is going to go to various managers around the organization, a lot of whom may not either be technical and understand the technical stuff, and also don't really have the time to consume that level of detail to ensure that they understand what you're talking about. And so on that point, make sure that as part of the content, you have a clear to understand executive summary at the beginning of the document, so that managers can quickly see what things were observed during the audit and are being reported as being effective, what good things are in operation and what they're encouraged to continue doing, and also where things can be improved and what actions are going to be required in order to ensure those improvements. One of the things I find useful sometimes is to include maybe graphs and charts, depending upon what it is you're auditing against, because that can very quickly draw the eye. It's very quick to understand when you see, out of the 93 controls, 60% of them are green and 20% of them are red, etc. We can identify very quickly where the problem is, we don't have to read all of the detail, or management don't have to read all of the detail. I guess the final thing with regard to the report is that, considering that we are reporting on maybe where weaknesses might exist and where improvements need to be made, that could be quite sensitive information and could be quite valuable to an attacker, for example, because if they know where your weaknesses are, they know how to exploit your organization. So ensure that you classify the document correctly. It's probably going to be confidential. Make sure you only distribute it to those people that are authorized to receive it. It's probably worth setting a retention period for it as well, to ensure that it is removed when it's no longer required, to reduce the chances of unauthorized access, etc. So yeah, that's a few things with regard to reporting.
And with audit findings, what are some reasons why there might need to be a follow-up on those findings?
Yeah, so the main reason really is with regard to effectiveness. So as auditors, we're not going to tell an organization what they need to do to resolve a problem, because if you do, that puts you in a bit of an awkward place with regard to the next time you perform the same audit, because if the organization has put in place what you suggested, then you effectively end up in a position where you might be auditing your own work. And so there's a bit of conflict of interest there. So what we try and do is sort of stay clear of telling them what to do. We just tell them what the problem is in terms of findings. So then the organization is going to have to sort of think, well, okay, I understand the finding. What am I going to do about it? They'll make a decision on action to be taken, and they'll implement that action. One of the things that we need to know, though, is whether or not that action that they've taken has been effective in terms of the finding in the audit report. Now, probably the best person to decide that would be the auditor, because they know why they raised the finding in the first place. Now, depending upon the level of finding, there's probably a couple of different approaches to follow-ups. So we tend to have three different levels of findings when we raise findings in audits. We have something called an opportunity for improvement. We have something called a major non-conformity, and we have a minor non-conformity. Opportunities for improvement really don't necessarily need any corrective action to be put in place. It's really just a suggestion with regard to how things might be improved, based around the best practice guidance I mentioned earlier on in 27002. So we're not necessarily expecting any action to be taken there. It's up to the organisation to see whether there's a benefit to doing it, etc. But with the minor and major non-conformities, that's where we're saying that based upon the criteria that we're auditing against and based on the evidence that we've seen, something's not quite right and you need to fix it. So with regard to minor non-conformities, these are not seen to be systemic lapses in the management system or severely impacting lapses in the effectiveness and controls and things like that. So generally the approach would be that we would follow up on those findings at the next scheduled audit where that control or clause would be covered. And at that point, we would consider the action taken, because the time delay in doing that is probably not going to be impactful on the organisation because it's only a minor non-conformity. Major non-conformities are different. This is where we're seeing either a systemic lapse in the management system or a really significant failure with regard to certain controls or sets of controls, etc., that suggest that the management system is not operating effectively. And so therefore it could be severely impacting on the organization. So then it means that it's probably worthwhile doing a specific follow-up much sooner. And then depending upon what the finding is and where it is and the impacts involved, etc., the auditor would normally agree a time frame with the auditee to follow up. And that would be based upon not only availability, but also how long will it take for them to put corrective action in place. If it's going to take 6 weeks for the corrective action to be put in place, then we'll probably arrange to come back in 6 or 8 weeks to determine whether or not it's been effective, and then obviously close the finding down. So that's a little bit about follow-ups. I think the main one really to consider is where major non-conformities severely impacting things that are wrong. I think that's the main one to concentrate on and ensure that you have an effective follow-up process in place to ensure actions are effective.
And what must have been done before you can consider an audit closed?
So there's 2 or 3 things really. So we would obviously have issued the final report. That would be distributed to those managers that have been identified in the opening meeting, etc., that we talked about earlier on. Usually, if there are non-conformities that have been raised, either minor or major non-conformities, then management responses to those non-conformities will have been received by the auditor. The auditor will review what the organisation intends to do and would essentially write back and say, yes, that looks like a suitable solution, or no, you've misunderstood the requirement, etc., and maybe point them in the right direction. But we've had some response from management. And if there have been any follow-up requirements, that those follow-ups have actually taken place. And the actions taken have been looked at and documented, etc., so that then the audit report can be updated associated with those. And then essentially you would consider the audit to be closed. You wouldn't necessarily expect that the audit findings have been resolved necessarily, but there should be a plan of action in place and documented and ready to be implemented. It could be that when we come back next time and look at the minor non-conformities, that the problem hasn't gone away, and what's likely to happen is that the finding will be carried over onto the next audit report, so that the first audit would be closed, and then we move on to the second audit, having carried over maybe a couple of minor non-conformities or something. So in short, final reports being issued, responses from management around findings have been received and agreed, and all follow-up actions have been completed.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Wayne. And for our listeners that want to know a little bit more about this subject, we have a webinar that takes a deeper dive on this topic called ISO 27001 Internal Auditing, How to Plan an Effective Audit Programme. And that can be found on our YouTube channel, URM Consulting, and it will be linked in the description of this episode as well. So thank you so much for listening today. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.